Curaçao, August 1795. Under the burning sun of the cane fields, Tula dropped his machete into the dust. He raised his head and declared, "We are no longer slaves." Over 1,000 voices answered, turning the island into a battlefield for freedom. The Caribbean sun beat mercilessly on Curaçao, an island claimed by the Dutch West India Company, its soil stained with the sweat and blood of thousands of African men and women. By the late 18th century, Curaçao had become one of the most important hubs in the Dutch slave trade. Ships arrived, filled with human cargo, chained together in suffocating holds, only to be auctioned like livestock upon the harbor. From there, many were forced onto plantations that stretched across the island, their lives consumed by endless rows of sugarcane. The work was brutal. At dawn, overseers armed with whips drove men and women into the fields. The cane's sharp blades tore at bare skin, leaving cuts that festered in the tropical heat. Baskets of cane had to be carried under the lash, while the sun turned sweat into salt burns across their backs. Food was meager, clothing was rags, and rest was rare. To resist meant punishment lashes that ripped flesh apart, chains that bit into ankles, or worse, death. But even in these conditions, the enslaved carried fragments of hope. They sang songs from their homelands, whispered prayers in the night, and passed on stories of freedom that could not be erased. Among them was the name Haiti. News had traveled across the sea of a revolution, where the enslaved had overthrown their masters and declared a free republic. To the Dutch, it was a nightmare. To those in Curaçao, it was proof that the impossible was possible. And in the shadows of the plantations, one man began to emerge. He was not a prince, not a soldier, not a scholar. His name was Tula. He was, by every measure, an ordinary field worker, forced to labor under the same brutal system as thousands of others. But within him burned a vision larger than the cane fields, larger even than the island itself. Whispers of his words spread quietly at first. He spoke of justice, of dignity, of a life not bound by chains or the whip. He listened carefully to the tales of Haiti, studied how enslaved men there had risen in unity, and realized that Curaçao, too, could rise. For every man and woman forced into bondage, freedom was not just a dream, it was a right. Curaçao was an island in chains. But in 1795, the chains would begin to tremble. Tula was not born into power. He was not trained as a warrior, nor educated as a statesman. He had no title, no wealth, and no inheritance. Only the scars of labor on his hands and back, and the relentless endurance of a man who refused to be broken. On the surface, he was like countless others, a black man working the cane fields, rising each morning to the crack of the overseer's whip. Yet those who knew him sensed something different in his presence. He carried himself with a calm authority, a quiet strength that inspired trust. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people listened. The world around him was shifting. In Europe, revolutions were reshaping kingdoms. In the Caribbean, the fire of Haiti's rebellion lit a torch visible from miles away. News traveled slowly but surely. Enslaved people had taken up arms, defeated armies, and created a nation of their own. For the enslaved on Curaçao, such stories were not distant legends, they were a promise. Tula absorbed every detail. He understood that freedom could not be granted, it had to be seized. But unlike those who imagined vengeance, Tula imagined justice. He did not dream of bloodshed for its own sake. Instead, he envisioned a society where men and women could work their own land, raise their families in peace, and worship freely without fear. His faith played a role. The Christian teachings preached by missionaries had been twisted by masters to justify bondage, but Tula read them differently. If God created all men equal, then no man had the right to own another. This conviction fused with the fire of Haiti's example to shape his destiny. Tula began to gather companions, speaking quietly under the cover of night. He urged patience, discipline, and above all, unity. Without unity, the revolt would collapse. With it, they might stand a chance. His words carried weight, not because they promised glory, but because they promised freedom. To his fellow workers, he was not just Tula the man, he was Tula the voice of their unspoken dreams, the man who dared to look a master in the eye and believe that the world could change. And when the time came to act, it would not be a cry of vengeance, but a declaration of humanity. We are no longer slaves. The morning of the 17th of August, 1795, began like countless others on the island of Curaçao. The sun climbed above the horizon, casting its merciless heat across the sugar fields. Overseers barked orders, whips cracked, and men and women bent their backs beneath the weight of cane. To the Dutch masters, it was another ordinary day of profit. To Tula, it was the day the world would change. He set down his machete and did not pick it up again. Instead, he gathered a small group of trusted companions and began walking away from the fields, away from the whips, toward the neighboring plantation. His act alone was a defiance punishable by death, yet with each step, he carried something greater than fear, conviction. When he reached the next plantation, he stood before the enslaved workers and spoke words that electrified the air. "We are born free. No man owns us. No master can claim our lives." His voice was calm but resolute, echoing with the authority of truth. The response was immediate. Heads lifted from the cane stalks, eyes that had long been cast down turned toward him with a spark of recognition. These were words they had carried in silence, whispered in secret, but never dared to shout aloud. Now, spoken by Tula, they rang like the toll of a bell, announcing freedom. By nightfall, dozens had joined him. By the next morning, hundreds. Tula and his companions moved from plantation to plantation, spreading the call like wildfire. His message was not one of chaos, but of unity. He insisted they were not beasts seeking destruction, but human beings demanding dignity. News spread faster than the overseers could contain it. Enslaved men and women dropped their tools, abandoned the cane fields, and marched to join the gathering force. The number swelled 500, then 800, then more than 1,000. What had begun with a single voice had become a chorus. The island trembled beneath it. The March of Freedom was not quiet. It shook the island like a storm. Men and women armed themselves with whatever they could grasp: machetes from the fields, sticks, stones, even kitchen tools. In their hands, these ordinary objects became weapons of defiance. For generations, they had labored under chains. Now, they carried the instruments of their rebellion. Tula led with discipline. His orders were clear. Protect the innocent, spare women and children, do not kill without cause. He knew that the rebellion would be judged not only by its courage, but also by its conduct. To prove their humanity, they had to act with restraint, even in the heat of war. The revolt struck first at the symbols of their bondage. Storehouses were raided, chains broken, muskets seized from the hands of their captors. Cane fields were set ablaze, flames rising into the Caribbean night sky like fiery beacons of liberation, the air filled with smoke and the scent of burning sugar. The fields that had once enslaved them now burned as testimony to their refusal. For the first time in living memory, the balance of power shifted. The Dutch planters, long accustomed to command, felt the ground tremble beneath them. They fled behind fortified walls, shocked by the scale of the uprising. They called it a mob. But those marching under Tula were no mob. They were an army of freedom, thousands strong, moving with purpose and hope. Drums beat in the night, songs of Africa mixed with cries of determination. Men sharpened machetes under the moonlight. Women carried water and food to sustain the fighters. For a brief, blazing moment, Curaçao was no longer a colony of chains, but a battlefield where freedom breathed. And at the center of it all stood Tula, calm amidst the fire. His machete rested at his side, but his true weapon was his voice. Again and again, he repeated the words that had carried them this far: "We are no longer slaves." The night of uprising had come. By dawn, nothing on the island would ever be the same. What began as a march of defiance soon transformed into something larger: an army. Not an army in the European sense, with polished uniforms and muskets gleaming in the sun, but an army of the oppressed men and women forged by years of suffering, united by a single cause. Every step added to their ranks. Field hands abandoned the cane. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and cooks left their posts to join. Women marched beside men, some carrying children on their hips while clutching stones or sticks in their free hands. For them, this was not simply rebellion, it was survival. Freedom meant life, and they would not turn back. Tula, though no trained commander, led with a wisdom that shocked even his followers. He demanded discipline where others might have surrendered to chaos. Looting was forbidden. Violence against innocents was condemned. He reminded them that their fight was not against life itself, but against the system of bondage. "We are not beasts," he told them. "We are human beings." Such restraint set him apart. Where European soldiers crushed rebellions with cruelty, Tula envisioned a revolution grounded in justice. His followers obeyed, not out of fear, but out of respect. He had become more than a man, he was the embodiment of their dignity. Armed with machetes, hoes, and stolen muskets, they advanced from plantation to plantation. With each victory, more chains were broken, more men and women joined. The Dutch masters saw destruction. The enslaved saw liberation. At night, fires burned across the island, not random acts of arson, but flames of reclamation. The cane fields that had consumed their lives were consumed in return. The crackle of burning stalks echoed like drums of war, sending a message to the colonists. Curaçao would no longer bow quietly. The Dutch planters panicked. To them, this was an unthinkable nightmare. Slaves organizing not in isolated acts of defiance, but as a united front under a leader with vision. For the first time, the masters feared the very people they had believed powerless. And so the army of Tula marched on, a tide of humanity carrying hope in their hearts and fire in their hands. In Willemstad, the colonial capital, fear spread faster than smoke. The Dutch authorities gathered in urgent councils, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Reports arrived one after another, plantations abandoned, fields burning, hundreds upon hundreds of enslaved men and women moving in formation. By some accounts, the number had swelled beyond 1,000. For the colonists, this was no longer a disturbance, it was a war. The Dutch governor called upon every resource at his disposal. Soldiers were dispatched from the forts, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. Local militias were raised, arming Dutch settlers and even free men of color loyal to the crown. Cannons were positioned to guard key roads, and cavalry patrols swept the countryside. Yet behind their preparations lay a deep unease. They had seen what had happened in Haiti, where the might of Europe had been humbled by men who had once labored in chains. Could Curaçao follow the same path? Could the colony itself be lost to a tide of rebellion? Still, the authorities clung to one advantage. Weapons, muskets, cannons, and trained soldiers gave them power that machetes and stones could not match. They believed that sheer firepower would crush the uprising quickly and restore order. But Tula's movement was not so easily extinguished. When Dutch envoys attempted negotiations, Tula stood firm. He declared that they did not seek senseless violence, they sought freedom. If the Dutch masters refused, then blood would follow. He demanded recognition of their humanity, a demand that no amount of musket fire could erase. The governor dismissed such appeals. To him, granting freedom to one meant threatening the entire colonial order, and so he prepared for battle, convinced that terror would bring submission. The island teetered on the edge of chaos. In the cane fields, thousands marched behind Tula, their resolve unbroken. In the forts, Dutch cannons waited, their iron mouths aimed at those who dared to defy. The stage was set. Curaçao was about to drown in fire and blood. The rebellion's fire burned bright, but it was about to meet the steel of Europe. The Dutch forces advanced with grim efficiency. Soldiers in uniform marched under the flag of the Netherlands, muskets gleaming in the sun, cannons dragged behind them on rattling wheels. The planters had armed themselves as well, joining militias with the determination of men fighting for their wealth and privilege. Against this, Tula's army, barefoot men and women armed with machetes, sticks, and faith, stood in defiance. The clash came in open ground, where the sugar fields met the hills. The first shots shattered the air. Muskets fired in volleys, white smoke rising above the battlefield. Men fell screaming into the grass, their blood soaking into the very soil they had been forced to till. The enslaved, charged with machetes raised high, voices carrying cries of freedom that drowned out the crack of gunfire. But courage could not stop bullets. For every Dutch soldier cut down, many more of Tula's followers collapsed under the rain of lead. The sound of cannon fire thundered across the island, echoing like a storm. Shrapnel tore through bodies, scattering men who had only known the weight of cane stalks. Still, they fought. They charged again and again, wielding their machetes, as if each swing could carve a path to liberty. Women joined the fray, throwing stones and boiling water, anything they could muster against the enemy. Children carried messages through the fields, risking death to keep the army connected. Tula himself stood in the thick of the struggle. His machete flashed, but more than his blade, it was his presence that carried his army forward. He shouted not orders of slaughter, but words of conviction. We are men, not animals. We fight for freedom, not vengeance. Yet the imbalance was undeniable. The Dutch line held, reinforced by fresh troops and superior firepower. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned. The bodies of the enslaved lay scattered across the cane fields, the ground wet with blood. As night fell, the rebellion staggered but did not die. Survivors slipped into the forests and marshes, still clinging to hope, but Tula knew the war was entering its darkest chapter. The Dutch would not rest until he was captured, and his people crushed. The rebellion's strength waned under the relentless weight of Dutch arms. Though pockets of resistance remained, the colonists' superior firepower and resources gradually smothered the uprising. Villages were raided, captured rebels, executed publicly to spread terror. Curaçao, once trembling under the cry of freedom, was being forced back into silence. Tula became the prime target. To the Dutch, he was not simply a rebel, he was the embodiment of resistance, the voice that had awakened an island. If he lived, the dream of freedom would live with him. And so, they hunted him with ruthless determination. Weeks of pursuit ended in betrayal. Lured into a trap, Tula was ambushed and taken alive. Shackled, bruised, and exhausted, he was dragged before Dutch officials. The same calm that had carried him through fire still lingered in his eyes. Even in chains, he carried himself with dignity, refusing to bow his head. The colonists wasted no time in making an example of him. They ordered his torture designed not only to break his body, but to shatter the spirit of those who had followed him. He was beaten, whipped, and tormented in public. His cries were not of surrender but of endurance, echoing across the crowd as a final testimony. Finally, in October 1795, the authorities sentenced him to death. The execution was brutal, carried out with deliberate cruelty. His body was broken, his life extinguished, his remains left as a warning. To the Dutch, this was the end of rebellion, the silencing of a dangerous voice. But for those who had marched with him, and for the generations that came after, it was something else. It was the martyrdom of a man who had dared to stand against an empire. His death was not silence, it was a seed planted in blood, destined to grow. Tula had not lived to see freedom, but he had proved that even on an island of chains, one man's voice could shake the foundations of power. His captors believed they had erased him. Instead, they had written his name into history. The flames of the 1795 uprising were extinguished in blood, but the ashes refused to disappear. Though the Dutch restored their order through brutality, the memory of Tula lived on among those who had marched with him, whispered from generation to generation. In the immediate aftermath, the colonists tightened their grip. Punishments became harsher, restrictions heavier, and surveillance constant. They believed fear would erase rebellion from the minds of the enslaved, yet fear could not erase memory. In secret gatherings, in the soft rhythm of drums, and in the hushed songs sung at night, the name Tula lingered like a spark that refused to die. For decades after his death, Curaçao remained a colony chained to the Dutch crown. But the echo of 1795 endured. It was a reminder that the enslaved were not voiceless, not powerless, not resigned to fate. They had risen once, and they could rise again. The Haitian Revolution had inspired Tula. In turn, Tula's revolt inspired others across the Caribbean and South America. His rebellion became part of a wider storm that would eventually sweep slavery into history's grave. When emancipation finally arrived in Curaçao in 1863, nearly 70 years after his death, many looked back to Tula as the man who had first dared to declare freedom on the island's soil. In the 20th century, his story grew stronger. Curaçaoans, searching for identity and dignity, reclaimed him not as a defeated rebel, but as a national hero. Monuments were erected. His name was taught in schools, spoken in parades, and honored each year on the anniversary of the uprising. For the descendants of those enslaved, Tula was not merely history, he was heritage, a symbol that no matter how powerful the chains, the human spirit cannot be silenced forever. His life became a testament that freedom, once imagined, cannot be unimagined. Curaçao, once an island of chains, now remembers him as the man who broke the silence. Tula did not win a battlefield. He did not topple the Dutch Empire. He did not live to see freedom written into law. And yet, he won something far greater. By standing in the cane fields of Curaçao and declaring, "We are no longer slaves," Tula carved those words into history. His body was broken, but his defiance survived, carried in memory, in song, in the quiet dignity of a people who refuse to forget. Today, his story is not just about one island or one revolt. It is about the universal truth that no chain can hold forever, no whip can silence forever, no empire can rule forever. Tula's victory lies in remembrance. He reminds us that freedom often begins not with armies, but with a voice that dares to say no more. And so, centuries later, Curaçao still answers his call. We are no longer slaves,